Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a principal customer engineer focused on management technologies. Today's discussion is part two of a series talking about compliance policy in Microsoft Intune, which of course is part of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Today's focus area will be compliance policies themselves, right? Now, part one of the series was basically an overview, a high-level view of compliance policies. There will definitely be some repeat between part one and part two today. There will definitely be some differences between part one and part two today. Drilling in a little bit deeper, seeing these things work in different forms and so on, right? Let me say up front too that whenever we talk about compliance policies, these apply across all supported platforms that we can manage in Intune: Android, iOS, Windows, Mac. All of those can be configured to leverage compliance policy. You will see me configure or show you the configuration options for all four. When it comes to the actual live demo part of this, I'm only going to do that with iOS and Android rather than make you sit through watching the same kind of thing again, and again, right? All of them work similarly, so I chose iOS and Android kind of as examples, right? So we'll talk about that more whenever we get there. Here's the agenda that we're headed toward. What are compliance policies? Why compliance policies? Why do we care? And then focusing in on compliance policies, what are the requirements? I want to talk about some scenarios. Configuring them, that's where I'm going to talk about Windows and iOS and Mac and Android. Then in action, that's where you'll see iOS and Android. We'll wrap up with some troubleshooting tips and tricks and be done, right? Okay. Now, also, let me share with you a little bit of nomenclature up front. So, compliance policies is one section of Intune, right? Configuration profiles is another. And maybe it's just me, but oftentimes I hear the two kind of mixed together when people talk about it. So sometimes I will hear compliance profiles and configuration policies, and that's not the correct naming. It's compliance policies and configuration profiles. So compliance policies are exactly kind of what you would think by the name. Mainly, and there's an asterisk here, but mainly compliance policies are going to check what your settings are and respond to you with an compliant, devices compliant, or devices not compliant. That's the result of the compliance policy check. Compliance policies are not really about setting anything. Again, there's an asterisk there because in one area they are, but in general, it's basically checking the configuration. Configuration profiles are all about configuring devices, right, and settings and user experience and so on, right? So just a little bit of terminology, nomenclature up front as we jump into things. Okay, so jumping right in. Moving into this, what are compliance policies? Well, this slide is identical to the one from part one. I think it's identical. I might have made a change or two in one of these. I don't know. But compliance policies basically are rules. They are settings that you want to evaluate against devices in your environment to determine, are these devices compliant with the corporate policy that has been defined as required for the devices. You'll see the options for that in a minute, and we'll talk about some different ways to maybe set up compliance policies as we go through, but generally that's what they are. Being able to use those rules and settings to assess the compliance of the overall device. Again, compliance policies largely are about checking things on the device, really not about configuring things on devices with that asterisk, out there in one corner. So why do we care about compliance policies? Well, compliance is huge. It's really a big deal in what you might want to be able to do and control and use in certain definitions. What do I mean? Well, compliance works with Azure Active Directory, right? That's basically where Intune lives, and so of course it does work with Azure Active Directory. It also works with conditional access, which is part of Azure Active Directory, and this is a big deal. It's something that we will talk about in part 4 of this series. So conditional access is this piece that helps protect organizational data by requiring users and devices to meet certain requirements. Compliance is one of many options that you can configure with conditional access, but it really can play a heavy role in conditional access. For example, device compliance against critical configurations can make a determination whether or not users are able to access corporate resources such as email or data on SharePoint sites or whatever, right? So we'll talk about that more when we get to the conditional access discussion in part 4. There's also configuration manager integration. So compliance is calculated based on configurations that are placed into Intune. But for Windows devices, often those devices are managed as well with Configuration Manager, and you can use Configuration Manager to implement additional compliance checks, if you will. And then it's a combination of Intune and Configuration Manager together in that kind of scenario for Windows devices that will determine the overall compliance score. Again, we'll get into that in part 3, which will be the next part of the series. Compliance policies. What are the requirements of setting up compliance policies? Well, you need Intune. It goes without saying that's where the compliance policies are defined. If you're going to be using conditional access, you need Azure AD Premium, and then you need, obviously, one of the supported platforms at least that you might want to configure this on. So Android, iOS, macOS, Windows 10 8.1, Windows Phone 8.1, all of those we can work with for compliance policy, right? And then the device has to be enrolled. So a single device enrolled to multiple users is not supported. That can be a scenario. That's what I do in my lab in some cases. So that's not a common thing. But the more common thing is a single user that has multiple devices. That is a supported scenario, right? So to go through that again, if your users, if you have a group of users that share a device, then that device being dealt with conditional access for those multiple users is not supported, right? The device itself could be targeted with compliance policies, but the users in that scenario, not so much. If you have a user that has multiple devices like I do, then yeah, that's supported. And certainly the scenario with one user to one device, that is totally supported. But either way, the device has to be enrolled. Okay. So a few scenarios that I want to just chat about with compliance policies. And there certainly could be more, right? So I've already mentioned conditional access. And so this would be that piece that works in combination with other things to help you govern control to, again, things like email or corporate resources, SharePoint, that kind of thing, right? Enrollment is another one. So I'm going to show you an example in just a minute where if your conditional access, I keep saying that, sorry, I'm going to try not to do that. If your compliance policy is not configured in a way that your device is compliant when it enrolls, then it's not going to be allowed to enroll, right? And I'm going to show you that example on iOS. Interestingly, that same example does not apply to Android, so there are some differences within the device. I haven't found a configuration reason why it is that way on iOS and not that way on Android, but you'll see that in just a minute. And then there's a scenario where you might want to give users clarity. I'm going to show this to you as well, right? Effectively, the way that I'm going to show you compliance policy, each OS will have multiple options that you can configure for compliance policy. So there'll be options for example, minimum, maximum operating system version. There will be options for disk encryption. There will be options for password length and so on, right? Each of those will be in unique sections within the compliance policy setting. If the device is out of compliance, the user will be told that the device is out of compliance, but they won't necessarily be told why, right? There is a scenario that I'm going to show you where you could configure letting the user know exactly why their device is out of compliance should it fail compliance checks, right? So I'll show that to you for sure in a minute. It's just one example in the scenario. There's multiple ways you can implement this, whatever makes sense for your organization. Certainly do, but I'll talk through that more in just a minute. Having multiple compliance policies. So by default, there are compliance policies for Windows and iOS and Android. Interestingly, there's not for Mac OS, but for those other three, there are default compliance policies. There's reasons that there are default compliance policies. I'll show those to you in a minute. You might want to have multiple compliance policies. Could be that you have a certain version of Android device, a certain type of Android device, and you want that compliance policy to be different than other types of Android devices. Certainly a possible scenario. You can do that, no problem, right? So we'll get into a discussion. Should you use the default compliance policy only? Should you do multiple compliance policies? Should you break things up to help bring user clarity? There could be more scenarios. Those are just ones that come to mind as I was setting this up. Okay, so all of that said, let's get into configuring this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through all four platforms, Windows, iOS, Android, Mac OS, in the Intune console. In fact, let me pull the Intune console in here. And then I'm going to go into the devices and show you some of this working. So let me just start in the console. Compliance policy is under devices. And while I'm in here, I can scroll down, and there's certain things. You can see compliance policies right here. We'll come back to this top level node. There's certain configurations. Well, let me just show it to you. If I click on compliance policies here, I'm going to see every compliance policy I have for any OS that I'm targeting, right? I will see options such as notifications, compliance policy settings, other things that we talked about in part one. I'll return to this in just a minute, right? But then if I'm really focused on just Windows and I go to Windows, I can see just the compliance policies applied to Windows. But notice, I don't see those other options available here, like notifications and so on. If I want to configure those, which we'll walk through in just a minute, I have to be at that top level node, right? Okay. Let's talk about Windows for a second. So I'm in the Windows node, so my compliance policies are filtered to just Windows. Notice that I have two compliance policies. One of them is the default compliance policy, and one of them is a custom one that I've created, right? This one is here, strangely, by default, right? You kind of pick that up from the name. And so what I want to do is review the settings that are within the default policy. And I also want to talk about, here again, here's the default policy. So you have something that you can configure and tweak and change to your liking if you don't like what's here by default. If you would rather, you can create your own custom policy and make your changes there. Let me also show you this, right? So if I click into the default policy and I go to properties, I'm going to get an overview of this particular policy. If I scroll down, here's my section where I will be able to see any compliance settings that have been defined. And you notice that this is blank. What that means is this policy is here, but it doesn't have anything set, right? Now, there's reasons that we have a default compliance policy, right? As you'll see in a minute, and I'll point out again as I get there, the settings in Intune are such by default that if there is not a compliance policy deployed to a device, that device will immediately be marked non-compliant. If that's the case, then it's not going to be able to pass any conditional access rules that you've set up requiring a compliant device, right? And so these default compliance policies are here, they're in place, they are deployed, in this case, to all users and all devices, right? Right down here. And so immediately, whenever we do that check to find out, hey, here's a Windows device, by the default settings, it has to have a compliance policy assigned, otherwise it's going to be non-compliant. We're going to satisfy that check of having a compliance policy assigned. But this compliance policy isn't going to look at anything because it's not configured to do so, right? So understand that about your default. Now, you could go into your default and you could change it to look at things, but you might rather leave the default alone and create your custom policy to define specifically what you want to look at, right? Okay, so let me show you what I have here, and then we'll look at the custom where I do have some things defined. So let me go into this for just a second. Move back up here. Okay, so if I go into compliance settings, then I will see the various options that I have. So there are 5 big categories that contain settings. So just, again, fast forwarding a bit, I was talking about another strategy where you could actually build multiple compliance policies and do it in a way that you might have for Windows 5 different compliance policies. One compliance policy for device health, one for device properties, one for configuration manager compliance, one for system security, and one for Defender ATP, right? And then you can assign those out to your environment, and then if one particular section is the cause of having the device be non-compliant, then you can let the user know that's what's going on. Again, more on that in just a minute. While we're here though, under device health, here are the various options that you can configure. So this is data coming from the Windows Health Attestation Service, again, unique to Windows, whether we want to require BitLocker or not, require secure boot to be enabled on the device, require code integrity. Again, none of these are configured by default. You can turn them on. I would recommend that you turn them on in certain scenarios, and you can decide, but that's what those are. Device properties. So what is the minimum and the maximum OS version? What about if you have mobile devices, right? Is that going to be something that's different? Do you want to specify valid operating system builds that you would support in your environment, right? Configuration manager compliance. This is that one we'll talk about in the next session that is unique to Windows, right? We can reach out to configuration manager if you require it and join the compliance policy assessment from both config manager and Intune together into a final result. And then here, system security, we have options in terms of whether we want to require a password to unlock the mobile device. This is where you're turning this to required. We can get in here and set some of these if we want to. And then finally down below, here we have Defender ATP. If you have that configured, you can make some changes here, right? And that's it. Now, this is my default compliance policy. Let me go ahead and leave this and scroll down while I'm in this compliance policy and just highlight 2 other sections that we'll talk about. And so here's the place where I define what specific settings will cause my device to either be non-compliant or be compliant, right? You'll see an example of that in my custom policy in a minute. If my device is assessed to be non-compliant, then here's where I can specify actions for that non-compliant. So I'll visit back to here in a minute. By default, we're going to mark the device as non-compliant and do that immediately, right? That's here by default. But there's options here as well where you can send a mail to the end user or remotely lock the device or retire the device if you wanted to, depending on non-compliance. There's other things that feed in here. For example, the list of options, all 3 of these options I believe are applicable to all platforms, Windows, iOS, Android, Mac. But there are certainly there's an additional setting that would be applicable to iOS and Android that you can see, and I'll show you that in a minute. So that's where you can define actions, if you want to, for non-compliance. And then, of course, here is where you will assign the compliance policy to who you want it to. Now, again, this is deployed to all devices and all users. Let's talk about that for just a minute. As a general rule, I'm not a big fan of applying to all devices and all users, right? In this case, this is a Windows compliance policy. And if I apply this to all devices and all users, it's going to go out and be assessed by Windows devices and iOS devices and Android devices, right? And what I mean by that is the system will filter. Absolutely, it will filter uh, and prevent devices from actually getting policy that it doesn't need to get. So in other words, if I leave this all devices, all users, then a Windows device will get it for sure, but an Android device won't, an iOS device won't. But the service will still have to deal with that and make that determination. And I just don't think in general it's a good idea to use all users and all devices. Rather, what I would do is maybe have a group of Windows devices, a group of iOS devices, a group of um, Macs, whatever, and then adjust the assignment there. Here's another little bit of an oddity, maybe, that I want to highlight for you. One of the things that I've said in previous sessions, and generally holds true, is that there are some configurations in Intune that will apply to all devices. I'm sorry, that will apply to devices, and they will apply to users, and it's completely up to you. There are other configurations that really only make sense to users, and some maybe that only make sense to devices, right? And some of the guidance that I've given is that you can look at our options for assignment and use that kind of as a judge to say, oh, this would work with only users, or this would work with both devices and users. Here's an exception to that rule. You see that by default, this is targeted to all devices and all users, right? So we wouldn't target our default compliance policy to all devices and all users if that somehow wouldn't work. But if you go in to edit this and you look at the dropdown, assign to, here's where I would look at what's in the dropdown list and say, okay, hey, this would apply to users for sure, but it wouldn't apply to devices because I don't have an option for all devices in the dropdown, right? But that would be a false assessment in this case, right? I know that compliance policies will apply to devices just as much as they will apply to users because we have by default configured all devices and all users down here, right? So just pointing that out. Actually, as of this recording, I kind of raised that and I'm asking the product team about this. Seems to be oddity, but just wanted to call that out and let you know about that, right? Okay, so I spent a lot of time with this. I'm not going to spend as much time with the others because it's the same exact discussion. But what I do want to do is show you my custom Windows 10 compliance policy I have configured. If I look at properties on it, then, oops, sorry, I accidentally went back to the PowerPoint. If I scroll down and look at what specific settings are in the policy, now I do have some things in here. I'm going to require BitLocker, and there's one other thing I'm going to require, and so those will show up here, right? Now, this one that says require is a bit odd. It doesn't really tell you what it is, but if I go edit this, I know there's two settings that are configured to be required. Here's BitLocker, right? And so it is required. So let me sift through the other ones and see if there's anything else. Nothing under device properties that I've configured, nothing under configuration manager compliance that I've configured, but I know there's one more because I have required that second line. Under system security, let's scroll down and see if there's anything that I've configured. Nope, nothing here. And so it has to be under Defender ATP. And so let's roll down and see. Actually, no. So where did I configure that? I know it's in here. I thought it was in here. Maybe it's not. I thought I did. Anyway, but you definitely see BitLocker. I don't know. That may be just an showing a second line, and there's nothing here. That's kind of interesting. Okay, I'll chalk that up to a UI gremlin. No big deal. But so that's Windows, right? And that's spending some time with understanding what's out there. Now, let me shift over to iOS. So I'm going to go back to devices, and I'm going to focus in on just iOS. And you'll see that I have two configured compliance policies here as well. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly since we've already talked about it. Let's use the default and look at properties. And again, we'll see that there's nothing really configured here in terms of settings, but if we edit that, we'll see that there are four big sections, and there's one for email to start with. Unable to set up email on the device, required or not compliant, right? And so this hovering over the I will tell you what this is really about. So I'm kind of showing you what that's all about. There's also settings for device health. So this would be coming from detection whether the device is jailbroken or what the device threat level should be, and this all comes from Apple, right? Device properties. So this is one that I actually configure in the custom setting here, but I don't configure in this default one. And then finally, system security and what options are available, what enrollment types it applies to, and so forth, right? So same kind of deal. Now, one thing that I want to talk about, in fact, I'll save this for just a minute. I'm going to talk about restricted apps, but let me move over to custom policy for just a minute and show you what I have configured for iOS and iPad OS for custom policy. Let me look at properties, okay? So for compliance settings, you see that I have, in fact, specified the minimum OS is version 1. The maximum OS has to be no more than 5, which that's obviously a setting that will cause my iPad and iOS to be flagged non-compliant. But I want to start there and show you the results of that here in a minute. But just to show you that I do have some things defined here. Now, let me go into edit on this and then go back under device properties. System security. And there's one little thing here that I want to call out, and that's this thing called restricted apps, right? Now, there could be some apps in here or some apps on your device that you want to restrict. You see that I have one configured here already, Skype, right? And so if I detect that Skype is on the device is going to be marked non-compliant. There could be a variety of reasons you would want to detect an app on a device, and then if you see it, mark it non-compliant, right? And this allows you to do that. Now, the question is, how do I go get the various configuration settings in here that are required to set this up, right? So let me go show that to you for just a second. And as I set this up, just to call out, I mean, this is what you're going to see is one path to do it. There's actually a couple of different ways you could go get the same data, so don't be tied to just what I'm going to show you. But this is one example. So what I'm going to do is launch an additional browser. Let me do that. And search for Skype in my browser. So for example, Microsoft, Skype, Apple Store. Okay, good enough. And so that's going to give me a couple options. The first one is the Microsoft Store. That's not what I want. But the second one is the Apple App Store. And so right here, I see the URL for Skype in the Apple App Store. The URL is all I need. What I specifically want is this ID right here. So what, again, as a reminder, what are we looking for? We're looking for what's called the bundle ID for the app, right? And so first thing I have to do is get the actual ID of the app so that I can go find the bundle ID. So I know that it's 304-878-510, right? Good enough. Now that I know that, I'm going to go to another URL and interpret what the bundle ID is. So give me just a second. itunes.apple.com/lookup $ID equal. And now what I need to do is add that particular ID 304-878-510 to the URL and hit enter. And what's going to happen is I'm going to pop up, at least in Edge Chromium, I'm going to pop this up and I download a file called 1.txt. And then I'm going to go show that in the folder. I'm going to open it and open on another screen. Let me pull it in to the main screen. What I'm going to do is search for bundle. All right. And so I get to bundle ID. And so the bundle ID that I care about is com.skype.skype. And so that is what I'm going to configure in the restricted app section of Intune here, right? So you saw that I already had one there. So right here, Skype is just a name that I typed in, but the bundle ID com.skype.skype, that's where I got it, right? So I just wanted to show that to you since you might be interested in that and you might not know how to get that, right? Just kind of as a tip. Okay, moving on. So next, let me show you Mac OS. Again, this is not one that I'm going to demo live, but it's here. So let's look at, this is one also that does not have a default policy, but I do have one that I created. And so here, if I go into my custom policy, just to show you what's available here, scroll down to settings, you'll see that I do have a couple of things enabled. Firewall is enabled, and also allow apps to be downloaded only from the Mac App Store. So if I edit this, you'll see I have 3 sections. I have device health, device properties, so I can specify the operating system version information and so on. And then also system security. So for system security, here is where I'm specifying the firewall is required, and also only downloading Mac apps from the Mac App Store versus some of the other options that are here, right? So same kind of deal. That one's the one for the Mac, so showing that to you. And then finally, we will look at Android and see what's out there for Android. Okay, so Android, and then compliance policies here, just to see what's out here. And there's 3. Right, there's Android device admin default. So talked about before, device admin is a type of enrollment type for Android devices that is deprecated by Google. So we still support it for any devices that are enrolled device admin, but it's not something I'm going to spend a great deal of time, if any, talking about, certainly not in this session. And then we have the default Android enterprise profile, which is a work profile policy type. And then I have a custom Android work profile policy type. So the same settings in each. Let's look at just the custom for expedient. Well, we'll look at both. So if I look at properties like before, there's nothing really defined here. Actually, I think I might have defined something. Either way, nothing really defined in the default. But then if I go to my custom, we just go into that and show you the options that are in here for Android. All right, and then custom here, properties and settings. Oops, I did that again, sorry. Put the browser back up, there we go. All right, so here I'm specifying the minimum maximum OS version. I actually need to change that back. What I want to do. So anyway, I'll leave that alone. So you can spend, you can look at Defender ATP for Android. You can look at device health, similar options, but coming from Google. So they're Google specific. Your device properties, minimum maximum OS, and then system security. So you see a lot of commonality between the different compliance policies, and that's why I'm just going to show you demos on iOS and Android. Okay, so this is all about configuring, so far, compliance policy. And I've shown you all of the OSs, and also along the way, one of the things I showed you just as a reminder, and since we're on an Android device compliance policy now, let me go back to the previous level here. Okay, right? So if I look at the list of settings here, one of the things we've already talked about is the actions for non-compliance. If I edit this, there is an additional item in this list that was not there for Windows, such as send push notification to the end user. Right? What I want to focus on for a minute is this idea of sending an email to the end user. Right? So you have the ability to do any of these, but one thing you might want to do is, if a device is non-compliant, tell the user why that device is non-compliant. And so you can send a notification email to the user. Let me first show you where you configure the notification email. Right? So if I go back to devices and I go to the top level compliance policy section, then I'm going to have notifications. Right? And you see that I've configured a notification called devices wonky. Right? You can configure as many notifications as you need for your business purposes, and then tie them in selectively to whatever compliance policy, in this case, that you want to. Right? So if I just click on devices wonky, then you'll see the different properties of this. right? So let me just edit this. And so basically you craft whatever email you want. Mine is silly. Device is wonky, your device is wonky, sorry, you have a wonky device, and so on. You can decide how you do that, right? And so I just configured one. Now that I have it configured, if I go back to a given compliance policy, let me just go back for, well, it doesn't really matter. I'll just choose one, iOS compliance policy, go to my custom and go to the properties, and then scroll down to actions for non-compliance, edit. Then I can, from the list, decide I'm going to send an email to the end user. Great. So now that I've decided that, what email do you want to send? So I'm going to browse here. It's going to give me a list of all the emails I can choose from, and I can choose that and associate this particular notification with this particular compliance policy, save it, and off we go. And that way, if the device is flipped from compliant to non-compliant, the user will get an email that says, hey, your device is non-compliant. Here's what's going on, right, based on what you configure. So a very useful thing to be able to do to understand what's happening, right? So let's get rid of that. Wanted to walk through that. Those are the configuration options. Good configuration options, not a tremendous amount of complexity or difficulty here. Hopefully it's very straightforward, but still that's setting up the compliance policy scenario. And let me also tie back. So I just showed you the notifications, right? So I mentioned before that one of the scenarios might be that you want to tell the user exactly what's going on. And so you might craft your compliance policy in a way that, you have for iOS 4 different compliance policies, one for security, one for OS version, one for, whatever, each of the sections, and then you can have a separate email that goes to each one. So in that case, you might have multiple compliance policies, an email for each one. So if the device flips out of compliance because of one of the sections or two of the sections or whatever, the user can see exactly what's wrong, kind of in email, right? Anyway, not to belabor that point. Okay, moving on, I want to show you a few things with the device in action. Okay, so what I have, first of all, is I have an iPhone that is not currently enrolled, right? I don't pay any attention to the process that I'm going to walk you through. Let me pull in my iPhone. Okay, so here's the iPhone. I'm screen sharing from my iPhone. Don't pay any attention to the enrollment process. I was going to try this kind of to get to a state that I wanted you to see without making you watch the whole process, but it kind of timed out on me. So I'm just going to go ahead and go through that process again and show you the enrollment, right? So, and there's a whole series of videos on enrollment if that's something you want to understand. I'm not going to talk about it here at all. So I'm just going to begin the process, answer some of these questions, continue, continue, and continue, and continue again, sorry, and go ahead through the enrollment process. So stepping through. And yes, we have to watch this whole thing to get to the part that I want to show you for this this demo, but it's not a bad thing to watch as we go through. All right, so download management profile, I'm going to allow that. Okay, great. So now I need to go to settings and general and approve that profile here. Management profile, install, yes. I'm going to allow that, great. So it's going to install, hopefully correctly. Takes just a second to do that. Great, install, trust. I will use this moment to just call out, you're seeing the complexity of BYOD scenario for iOS, and I strongly would urge not to have your users have to go do this. If it's something that users want to do, great, but if you want their device managed, there's other easier ways to get that done. Okay, so I've approved that, and so here we go. So I'm going to answer this question. So it looks like my device is fully enrolled. This is a question, last question I'm having to answer is about device categories that I've had set up, which means the device is talking to Intune, so it looks like it's enrolled. So I'm going to select IT and select continue, and watch what happens. All right, so we're verifying the device right here, confirming device settings. So the device is going out and talking to Intune, right? And in a second, it's going to pop up a little message for us. Okay, and here's what we get. For some reason, it took a second to confirm. I had to retry, but either way, right? So why are we getting this message? I'm not allowed to complete my enrollment. Why exactly is that, right? Well, to remind, let me move this out to the side for just a minute, just to remind of why that is. Come on, grab it, move it. There we go. Okay, I'll move this out to the side. Let me pull the Intune console back in. So here's the Intune console, and look under iOS, iPad OS, and look at compliance policies. I have my custom compliance policy. Go back to properties and scroll down, and we'll see that my requirement for the device is that it be between version 1 and 5. Well, this device clearly is not at version 1 or 5. It's, I forget what it is, 13 maybe now. And so if I do the drop down, it's going to give me a link that I can go through, and basically this link is going to go to Apple with how to downgrade my OS or update or whatever, right? Which is not what I want. And so what I'm going to do is simply come in here to my compliance policy and make a change so that my my system will be allowed to do it, right? So I'll just say, I don't know, 20, something in here, no problem. And then scroll down. Let me move this over where I have more access to the scroll bar. Scroll down, and I'm going to review and save that setting. And so let me scroll down, and I will click on save. Great. So that's done. So that's just saved to the service, right? So I'm going to go that quickly, and I'm going to check my settings again. And now the device is going out and confirming again, whether I'm allowed to complete my enrollment based on the change that I just made. So you see that it's working on it, and we'll see what happens this time, right? And so that quickly, it's going to take a minute or two for the settings to come into play. And so let's just let it do it a couple of times and see what happens. All right, I'm going to check settings a third time. And if it doesn't work this time, I'll just give it a couple of minutes, not make you wait on it. Let me pause the video. I'll give it a couple of minutes to kick in, then I'll come back. Okay, and that quickly, I am all set. Everything's good. I have finished the enrollment. The device is in there. No problem. I had to wait maybe, since I paused the recording, maybe 4 minutes for everything to get in there, and I'm good to go, right? So now if I look at the device and just kind of scroll through the different options, where am I? Go away. So devices, iPhone. So you can see right here that the device is in compliance, right? So I have a couple of different devices actually enrolled under my user account, but you see that I'm in compliance. So what I'm going to do now is simply go back and change my compliance settings to where my device OS, allowed OS version, is back to that 5, right? And review and save that. And then save that, right? And save that. And so I can go check the device compliance anytime I want to by triggering a synchronization on the device. I can trigger that on the service side. I can figure that here. And so in the company portal, if I just tap on check settings, then that's going to go and trigger a policy check-in. And when I do the policy check-in, I'm also going to be assessing compliance. So while this is working, let me chat about that for a second. I'm going to have to do this a couple of times too because there's going to be a delay as it processes. So let me just wait. So understand, right? When you're considering compliance policy, just like the reason I did the demonstration I did at enrollment where you see that it's blocked is that we will assess compliance for the device immediately upon enrollment. So you want to have your compliance policy configured in the way you want it, right as the device is enrolled. Let me click check settings again. Right as the device is enrolled, because that way it still hasn't changed. That way you will have a real-time assessment of the compliance of your device as it enrolls, as it begins to try to communicate with your organization. Later on, that device will have to be triggered either manually to assess its settings, which also includes policy and compliance, either like I'm doing here on the device, triggered through the Intune console, or it's going to wait for its normal policy cycle, which happens. It's different based on the device, but you can plan on around 8 hours, right? Again, different between different devices, and they check settings again. And so just be aware of that, right? So we're going through, still in compliance. I'm going to pause and I'll come back after it switches, but it shouldn't take very long. Okay, and you see that it shifted. Now it is not in compliance. From the time I paused the video, it might have taken an additional 45 seconds for the service to let me flip. I just kept checking settings, but you get the idea with the device, with the Apple device, with the iPhone, how it works, right? Okay, so let's shift over to Android. So just as a reminder, right, I have the same kind of thing set for Android. In fact, I'm not even going to belabor the point, right? So you kind of get the idea. What I am going to do is share my Android screen real quick. Let me get that done. One more. So here is my Android device. For those that are interested, the first time that I shared, I was using a product called Reflective. This time I'm using what's built into Windows 10 now called Connect, just as an FYI. But on my Android device, if I go into my work profile and I look at Company Portal, then I will have the same experience, right? Again, I'm not going to belabor this on Android, but just to show you, right? So it's logging in, and then we will be able to go into my Android device and see compliance, right? The device you're currently using basically is should be in compliance, right? So right now the device settings in compliance. So now if I needed to go and trigger a settings check, I could do that through the company portal here just as well. But we're in compliance, right? Why are we in compliance? Well, let me get the Intune console back up here and get rid of Android for a minute. And navigating back to Android, scroll down. We're in compliance basically because the version of the OS is matching what I have defined in my custom Android work profile settings, right? So again, pretty obvious, but just making sure. So right, it falls within that range. All right, good enough. So that's really it for what I wanted to show you. Kind of working toward the end now. Let's talk about a couple of things. First, just a reminder on troubleshooting. Let me grab Intune again. So this troubleshooting blade is very, very helpful, right? So if I go down to troubleshooting and I log in with my user account, so I use the same user account for everything in my lab. All right, and then accept that, right? Then what I'm going to have as an option is to see what all compliance policies I have in my environment. And so it's going to show me, when it gets finished loading, the top 5, and then I can expand and go from there. Okay, so I see the top 5. I can go click on see all if I want to. No big deal, but let's go back to the troubleshooting blade, because what I really want to do is drill into a specific device. So imagine the scenario where a user has a device and that device somehow is not responding well. So let's just call this iPhone, the one I want to troubleshoot. So if I scroll down, then I can look at device compliance, and I can see what all device compliance policies are assigned to me or associated with that device. Now, a couple of perhaps oddities here, right? So whenever I did the iOS compliance policy, I actually saw 2 compliance policies, but here I see 3. So what's the difference, right? Well, the first, notice, is the default, let me expand that, or the iOS compliance policy, iOS default compliance policy. It actually lists as not applicable. Then I have the custom one, which now tells me I'm not in compliance, as I expected, right? Because I adjusted it back to have an OS version other than what would be on the device. And so that's fine. But just between these two, look, not applicable, not compliant. Why is this one not applicable? It's not applicable because, remember I showed you that in the default compliance policy, there is nothing defined. But in my custom compliance policy, I do have things defined. And so this one essentially is overwritten by this one because when you have multiple compliance policies, the most secure is going to win. But then notice I have the built-in compliance policy. What's built-in compliance policy all about? And why is it even here? Because if I go back to my devices and look at iOS and look at compliance policies, I don't have it here, right? But if I go and look under the top level compliance policies right here and look at compliance policy settings and the text right here, so this is where the built-in compliance policy is coming from. So the built-in compliance policy is also being assessed. It is these 3 settings. Remember, whenever I mentioned at the beginning of the session that the reason we have default compliance policy is because our settings require that if we don't have a compliance policy, that the device is immediately marked non-compliant. That's right here. And this is part of the built-in compliance policy, right? Other things to call attention to are things like compliance status, validity period, and so on. But right, we wanted to tie all of that together. Okay, now in terms of a few tips and tricks, we talked about the idea of built-in compliance policy just now and how that can play in the overall assessment. I've also already mentioned, but I want to mention it again, the whole idea of how compliance policy is assessed. So I mentioned that compliance policy is assessed first whenever the device is first enrolled. So you want to have your compliance policy set the way that you believe it should be from the get-go. But then every time the device checks in for policy, whether it be initiated from the device, whether it be initiated from the Intune console, whether it be initiated because of the policy check-in cycle, the device will again be assessed for compliance, right? So understand how that works. And then one of the things you've seen me do throughout the demos is use the company portal to see compliance on the device. So the question is the company portal required in order to do compliance assessment on the device? And the answer is no. It's very useful though, because you can see what's going on in the company portal. The user can interact with that, but it's not required. We can still assess the device for compliance without it. So I call your attention to an iOS device that's enrolled without user affinity. That's an example. Or Windows, where we can enroll the device and not have the company portal. That's another example. And then last thing I'll remind you of is the whole idea about strategy. I've mentioned a few strategic things throughout the session about what you might be able to do, whether you want to use just the default compliance policy, probably not, or a single custom compliance policy, or split out multiple sections of a compliance policy into multiple compliance policies, deploy them that way. The bottom line is figure out what works best for you and your organization, and you'll be able to do that in Intune, right? So that really wraps up what I wanted to talk about in this session. The next session, we'll talk about configuration manager integration with compliance policies for Windows, and we will see you next time.